Welcome to the show. It's always a pleasure to have you with us as we focus on Africa. This week we continue part 3 of our focus on refugees. We host the country director of UNHCR Kenya, Raouf Mazou. We get your views on the issues, and we have Africa's top 10. You're watching the Africa Leadership Dialogues. I'm Julie Gichuru. In part 3 of our focus on the refugee situation in Kenya, across Africa, and also globally, we host UNHCR Kenya Country Director Raouf Mazou.
Mr. Raouf Mazou is a representative of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Kenya. Previously, he was the Deputy Director in the Africa Bureau, covering the East and Horn of Africa region. He also served as Deputy Director of the Division of Operation Support and as Head of Emergency and Security Service. He has garnered expertise in areas such as emergency response, repatriation, and the development of strategies aimed at bridging the gap between relief and development.
Now let's get straight to his views on the issues. Raouf, thank you so much for coming once again to the Africa Leadership Dialogues. Now, this is a fascinating partnership with the World Bank, an engagement intended really to take a look at the economics around Kakuma refugee camp and its impact on the host community. What informed this process?
What informed this process was a conversation we had, I think it was in November 2014, with the governor of Turkana. The bank was present, a number of development actors, and that conversation was about how do you make sure that there is greater collaboration between refugees and host communities, and how do you make sure that all the assistance that is being provided to refugees benefits better the host communities. The governor of Turkana is somebody who's had an experience in the humanitarian world, in the development world, so he could see that things could be done differently. Right. But for things to be done differently, we needed to better understand truly what the dynamics were. Often we talk about refugee issues and the impact of the presence of refugees in a very emotional manner, but the issue there was to say, can we do it, can we measure the impact, positive or negative, of the presence of refugees, and that was the start of that process. And one of the number one conclusion of that initial conversation was to say that we needed facts, we needed data, we needed to be very rigorous in our analysis of the situation.
For you, when you look at the results of that report titled "Yes in My Backyard," what are the main takeouts that for you are eye-openers? One thing which may sound anecdotal, but which was even repeated by the lead researcher, was the fact that the further away you move from the camp, the more you have a negative perception of the presence of refugees. And the closer you are to the camp, the more you see that the presence of refugees can be something positive. So that's the result of detailed research. So it shows us that the least you know about something, the more you fear it.
The more you fear it, the more you have preconceived ideas. And refugee issues, and the way people deal with refugee issues is often about that. People who know refugees, who work with refugees, who interact with refugees would tell you that these are people who, because of the circumstances in their countries, had to cross the border, but these are people who are very inventive, business-minded, and can actually be very positive for the people who accept to welcome them. But you often have these people further away who do not know refugees, but who have very strong preconceived ideas. And often, unfortunately, the debate and the discussion is led by these people.
You know, Kenya has hosted refugees for so many years. It's decades. We have generations who have been born in this country and yet still have refugee status. There's the argument around whether we should have people in camps or whether we should work on integration. There's an argument around perhaps a model that is in between the two. The last time you were on the show, you gave us the example of Uganda, where refugees are fully integrated into the community. The world today, 90% in that report, we are told, of refugees in the world are housed by developing countries. We need sustainable solutions. Going by everything you've seen, your experience, outcome of this report, what do you believe is the way forward for countries that are housing refugees?
You know what is interesting is that if you look at the history of Kenya, as you said, Kenya has been receiving refugees since independence. And especially in the 80s, Kenya received a large number of Ugandan refugees. And when you discuss with people, they tell you that many of the Ugandan refugees who came to this country were their teachers, were actually economically integrated. Their talent, their knowledge was used. And from what I hear, the country benefited a lot from that. Early 90s, there were very large, massive population movements from Ethiopia, from Sudan, from Somalia. So at that point, the answer was to say, let's have people in camps. Anyway, it will not last. It will have a less negative impact on the economy of the regions which welcome them. Let's provide emergency response, and then they will go back to their places of origin. So that was the thinking. So there was a shift and a change in the policy of Kenya in dealing with refugees because of the sheer number. And I think there was also, from the international community, I thought the donor community, ourselves as UNHCR, thought that this was probably the best way because it would not last. The problem that it did last, the problem that you end up after 25 years with people, as you say, born in camps, had children in camps, and a situation that becomes impossible. The sad thing is that while it was initially seen as a way of protecting the economy of the regions which welcome refugees, the camp ends up being a place which the host population looks at as a place where better services are being provided. And that shouldn't be. It was mentioned in the launch this morning that the condition in the camps are often better than outside of the camp. Not to say that the way we did things in the early 90s was necessarily wrong, but I think we have to evolve, and we have to now realize and accept that this situation may last, and try to develop models that would actually look for an economic integration of the refugees who are in this country. That does not mean that they would stay. Eventually, refugees want to go back to their places of origin. They left not because they wanted to leave, but because of conflict, because of the circumstances. So we have to make sure that they, while they are in exile, can be part of the economy of the country where they are, and then eventually be better prepared to go back to their country and be part of the reconstruction efforts.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
It's fascinating you say in the 90s it wasn't necessarily a wrong approach, but it was a misinformed approach. There were assumptions that were made that did not work. We're now in a global environment where let's leave the assumptions alone, and just going by what you've done with this report, you're saying let's actually work on, as much as possible, data that makes sense, that is logical. One of the things that we can say in this current situation is that development budgets seem to be shrinking. And therefore there's a need to get more private sector involvement. Are you seeing an interest, or how do we create a movement within the private sector, or interest within the private sector to engage in what are seen as very unstable or risky, perhaps, areas and situations?
I think there are two things which have to happen. The first thing, for the time being, these camps are being fed, if I can use this term, or provided with humanitarian assistance, food assistance, free healthcare, free education. So this is there. So, and you have refugees who, for many years, have been used to this type of assistance. So you need to gradually change that and gradually make sure that the existing services provided by the government also extend to the refugee population. But that has to be gradually done. As humanitarian actors, we don't necessarily have the expertise to do that transition, and that's why it's important to have development actors on board and say, how do you transform? How do you transform healthcare, for instance, that is provided now? And you travel to Ifo, so the hospital that has been set up by the Red Cross. This is a place where you get free healthcare in a way that might be different than the way healthcare is provided in the rest of the country. So how do you transform that? So we need time, we need expertise for that. The other thing is that the camps have thriving economies led by entrepreneurs and the private sector already. But these are economies which are informal, which impact or are not necessarily captured formally, and that has to first be acknowledged, that you have traders in a camp, you have people who provide services, paid services. So that you have to acknowledge. And then one has to acknowledge that a number of private actors who come to the camp should be encouraged. Businesses, Safaricom is very present because people have mobile phones, and you have a number of other businesses that are in the camp. They need to be supported. Additional businesses must be supported to operate in the camp the way they operate in other environments, taking into consideration the size of the market that it represents, and taking also into consideration the resources that refugees have. Resources that they have as a result of this informal economy, and the resources that they have as a result of the remittances that some of them receive from families elsewhere. So it's really to look at the reality and say, this is a market. When you say that about a camp, you immediately have people say, but how can you say that? Are you going to allow businesses to take advantage of the poor refugees who are victims? The reality is that you do have people who are victims, who may have been victims in their country, but you also have people who want to be seen and treated not as victims, but as actors and people who actually control their own future.
And they still require commodities.
They do.
There are still things they will need to buy. I want to focus the conversation a little bit now on the Dadaab situation. And the closure is happening. This is a movement of thousands and thousands of people, which presumably will take place over a period of phases. Take us through this, Raouf. And are we ready? Is East Africa ready? Is Somalia ready for this? Are the refugees ready for this? Is Kenya ready to lose Dadaab? Although very often we don't think of it in those terms.
Kenya, as you mentioned yourself, is a country which has been exemplary for many years in providing protection assistance to Somali refugees. Kenya is the place where, for a long time and up to now, we have the largest number of Somali refugees. And they are not just in Dadaab, they're also in Kakuma, and they're also in urban settlements. The point which has been made by the government of Kenya is to say this is a forgotten crisis. You cannot let people live in a camp for 25 years and not see an end, not see a solution. That's what has been said over and over again by the Kenyan government. What the Kenyan government also said is that there are a number of refugees who would like to return to their place of origin and who are saying, I cannot go back to Somalia because I need to have access to healthcare, I need to have access to education, I need to have access to these basic services. The point that has been made by a number of people is that there are parts of Somalia that are safe, and there are parts of Somalia where these basic services could be provided and where support to livelihood could be provided. So the point is to say, let's try and do the maximum to help those who would like to return do so. A large number of those who are in Dadaab now, or were in Dadaab, came in 2011 after the drought and famine. We're talking about drought and famine today. The last large influx of refugees from Somalia was a result of the drought and famine. And we know that many of the refugees who came at that time have been going back and forth because some of them wanted to go back. They have land to use, to till, and have been going back and forth. The voluntariness of the return is something that we've stressed, Simply because if you try to force somebody to return, the person will go back, for sure.
They will find a way.
The person will find a way back.
Yes.
So what is necessary is to make sure that we create in Somalia the condition for a sustainable return. It requires a lot of resources. Somalia is a country which cannot borrow money from the World Bank or other development actors because it is in arrears from 25 years ago. But that has to be resolved because there is no way Somalia can get back on its feet if it does not have access to massive amount of resources to reconstruct its infrastructure. Everybody's very pleased that the electoral process resulted in an election of a president, but this president will need support if everybody wants the country to be rebuilt. And that's what will result in a significant number of Somali refugees going back to their country. Now, some Somali refugees who were born here, whose children were born here, may ask and may say, we would like to stay in Kenya. And this is a decision that the Kenyan government will have to make for those who have been there since the 90s, grew up here, went to school here, acquired skills here, which can help Kenya. There are a number of refugees who studied medicine, studied various fields, and who have been very active in helping Kenya. And they have to be looked at, and their need or the desire to remain in the country should be looked at by the country.
Raouf, if you were to share 3 mistakes that we've learned from and 3 key lessons we should all keep in mind, what would they be for everyone who's watching?
I wouldn't necessarily call it mistake, because if you look at the parameters that we had back in the early 90s, nobody could imagine that some of these refugee situations would last for 25 years. Nobody in the early 90s could imagine that the Somali conflict would last 25 years. So I think it's based on what we knew at that time, that some decisions were made. Decision of encampment was made, again, by not just the government of Kenya, but the whole donor and relief community. So I would say, rather than let's look at things today, let's look at new refugee situations that we have around the world. Let's look at the Syria refugee situation, which started 6 years ago, and which is today already described as one of the most protracted situations because of the pressure that it is creating around the world and the crisis that it has created. What we've drawn from the Syria situation is that you cannot let a refugee with no hope for 5, 6, 10 years, or even for 2 years. The hope and the prospect of a solution to one's problem, a sense that you would go back to normalcy and live normally even if you're away from your country, is what actually drives each of us. You need hope to be able to move in life. If you're left in a hopeless situation, you become a danger to yourself, to the community in which you are, and to everybody. So what I think we have to make sure is that even if one finds himself or herself in exile, one has to be given an opportunity to have hope, to live normally, a hope of staying in the place where you are so long as you need to, and the hope of going back to your place of origin and resume your normal life and be part of the reconstruction of your country. So today I would say it's to understand faster what the need of refugees are. As soon as you start providing an emergency response, you need to have development actors on board who can look at the long term. And that's a key thing that we have.
Finally, if you would speak to our audience, look into the camera, and my message, the final message that I want you to deliver today centers around the stigma that we have around the idea of refugees. Very often people sit back and you know, you'll never see yourself as a refugee, so you will always judge. They are the other. Why should we extend ourselves? What message would you have for everybody watching about refugees, please?
My message would be that we see around the world now an incredible number of people who have to flee their homes. This is something that can happen to each one of us, to everybody. And we all need to understand that it's not because you've had to flee your place of origin, your home, that you lost your talent, that you lost your knowledge, that you lost all hope to have a good life. And it is our responsibility to help those who've had to flee their home to return to normalcy and being able to contribute to the society in which they are, the society which has provided them with asylum, with help, with support. So it's a responsibility on the part of all of us, because it could happen to us, and also because we shouldn't miss an opportunity to take advantage of the expertise, of the knowledge that people have, and people who have had to flee their homes.
Thank you so much, Raouf.
Thank you.
As always, a great
Thank you
pleasure.
very much.
Thank you.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
It's a difficult issue, and for so many years, as has been said time and time again, Kenya has hosted refugees. It has been a haven for refugees. But can we do it better? Can we implement this in a more productive way, both for host communities and for refugees as well? And finally, can we make it a boon for the country? Big questions. Now, let's get your views on the issues.
This week, we asked you, what is the impact of refugees on the economy of the host country? Jacqueline Atieno says, growth of infrastructure and increased import-export trade is an advantage that is brought about by the presence of refugee camps to the host country.
My name is Grace Wangui. I'm watching African Leadership Dialogue from Angata Wangui. My view is that the refugee camps have become a breeding ground for lethal criminals and terrorists. In turn, they affect tourism.
To join our conversation, go to our G+ page, Africa Leadership Dialogues, on Facebook, Africa Leadership Dialogues, on Twitter, @AfricaLD, and on WhatsApp, send your video comments to +254 715 816 033.
And now to Africa's top 10.
On Africa's Top 10 this week, we feature the top countries with refugee exodus. The United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, paints a grim picture of the refugee crisis in Africa, with about 16 million people either displaced or forced to flee to other countries. The aim of the research was to determine the countries with the highest refugee exodus. This is according to the UNHCR. Starting us off with number 10 is Western Sahara. A disputed territory in the Maghreb region of North Africa, Western Sahara recorded a refugee exodus of 117,000. Coming in at number 9 is Nigeria. As a democratic secular country, Nigeria recorded a total of 168,000 refugees forced to flee the country because of the Boko Haram. Positioned at number 8 is Rwanda. Commonly referred to as the land of 1,000 hills, Rwanda lost a total of 286,000 of their citizens to other countries because of the 1994 genocide. Taking the number 7 spot is Burundi. The landlocked country in East Africa descended into chaos after the president announced he was running for a third term, thus forcing 293,000 of their citizens to flee to neighboring countries. Slotted in at number 6 is Eritrea. The country in the Horn of Africa reportedly lost a total of 411,000 of their citizens to its neighbors due to the elevated tension and threat of war in Ethiopia. At number 5 is the Central African Republic. A landlocked country in Central Africa, the Central African Republic has been characterized by ethnic and religious cleansing, forcing 471,000 of its citizens to flee. The Democratic Republic of Congo takes the number 4 spot. Despite being extremely rich in terms of natural resources, the Democratic Republic of Congo is politically unstable, with 541,000 of their citizens reported to have fled the country in search of a safe haven. Anchored in at number 3 is Sudan. The Sudanese civil war is responsible for putting many people on the run, with 629,000 reported to have fled the conflict. Coming in at number 2 is South Sudan. The ethnic violence and civil war in the country has forced a total of 778,000 South Sudanese to flee the country in search of stability. At number 1 this week is Somalia. The ongoing civil war in Somalia remains a huge factor influencing the high number of refugees, with over 1,123,000 reported to have fled the country. And that's Africa's Top 10 this week.
And it's my favorite time. It's time for words of African wisdom, our proverb this week.
If you throw nettles into your neighbor's garden, you will find them growing in your own.
As always, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Let's continue the conversations online. Blessings to you and blessings